me to introduce Joe's actual, as opposed to academic, son, David.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'm not a computer scientist, unlike most people here, though I appreciate the twin content that I can relate to. Yeah, I'm here purely by nepotism, as Raphael mentioned, but similar to some of my dad's students, who are academic children that we talked about today. We diverged pretty early on in our interests. I wanted to go to music school, and then yeah, I don't know. You always get sucked back into the fold, I guess. So here we are. I don't have that many, really, any experiences working with my dad academically, but I do remember at one of my first conference presentations, my dad happened to be in London for some reason at the same time, and we like sat on a. I'd gotten comments. Someone else was telling me about this. I'd gotten comments from my advisor like an hour before, and then my talk was like later that day, and my dad just like sat there and listened to the talk, and also gave me feedback at some point. So that was definitely helpful, console my nerves at that point. So yeah, that's my academic history with Joe Halpern. But yeah, so I'm a neuroscientist or cognitive psychologist, depending on the day. So hopefully I can make this topic a little bit interesting to some people here. We already heard about causal inference today. The title of my talk is "Why Do We Remember Some Things and Not Other Things?" And people who've read Pearl's book might recognize this as basically a why question, therefore a causal question. The alternate title for this talk is "Identifying Causal Subsequent Memory Effects," but this is a little bit maybe easier to understand for those outside of the field. So one of the big questions we tackle in the cognitive neuroscience of memory is why do we remember some things and not other things? Like I said here, there's lots of sort of ways that you can go about answering that. But I think when I approach this question, I think a lot of people in the field had not thought about this from a causal inference perspective, which really kind of affected some of the ways that people were answering it, and that is basically what this talk is going to be about, how we sort of applied causal ideas from causal inference to this specific scientific question. So first, I'll just tell you a little bit about how we generally study memory in cognitive science. Memory is a pretty challenging thing to study. We often want to know, like, you have some experience, and then we want you, for some reason, you are able to remember it later. It affects your behavior in some way, and we want to know what is it that actually caused you to do that. And so there are different things you might want to know, like how can I study better for a test, or depending on your age, how can I get my students to remember things better on the test? Where did I leave my car keys? Why am I forgetting things that happened to me a couple days ago for my dad? Although methods for studying these things in like a more naturalistic setting are pretty rapidly advancing. We're able to study like videos and more complex stimuli like that. And people having sort of like real life experiences, which is obviously much more interesting. The traditional way that we study memory to get really precise measurement is by using very simple experiences and then seeing what people remember about them later. So for instance, we might show people a pair of words like this. This is the English word shore and its Lithuanian translation, krantas. Hopefully no one knows how to speak Lithuanian here. And so we'll show them a pair of words like this. We might show them another pair of words, another Lithuanian translation, and then we can interrogate at some later date your memory for this experience in a multitude of ways. For instance, we can give you the Lithuanian word and ask you to come up with the English translation, or we could give you two words and ask you, is this the actual thing that you saw before, or is it some sort of recombination? This is called associative recognition. The other task, this is called cued recall, and there are a number of ways that people have studied this, but this is sort of the study of memory for like over 130 years or something like that has used these sort of very simplified tasks. And words are nice because you basically can either really say like, I do remember this, like you can actually provide the word, or you just are unable to recollect it. And so it's very easy to kind of quantify what's going on behaviorally. And so this 130 something years of studying memory this way has given us a lot of insight into why we do remember some things and other things. So one thing you'll notice in these tasks is that people get some of them right, they get some of them wrong. There's a reason for that. Um, and so one big group of sort of theoretical ideas about why you remember stuff is just the way that you experience it, how you study it. So how many times you see something. This is sort of going back to the classic Ebbinghaus studies that maybe you learn about in a psychology 101 class. Um, Also, the order in which things happen in an experience really matters for. We good? Oh, okay, cool. The order in which you experience things really matters, and also the way in which you first experience it, the task that you're kind of like maybe you are reading a word and you're asked to sort of imagine uh, that word, something about that, like it's a house or something like that, or you're doing a completely different task where you just have to like respond with what the first letter, whether the first letter of the word is vowel or not, and that can also really affect things. There's a number of effects like these, but just this kind of generally falls under the category of how you study something. We also know that the actual content of what you're experiencing really affects whether or not you're going to remember it later. Some things are just more memorable than other things. This is, I think, a pretty intuitive idea to most people, but it's kind of important, particularly for the study of memory, and it's going to be crucial for what I'm talking about later. So this can also depend on something's relationship to other things that you're studying or experiencing. So it's easier to remember things that are maybe really surprising, not expected in a particular context. But yeah, but so this face on the right is I think way easier for most people to remember if they had to recognize it later. Similarly for this scene of beaches, I think it's the one on the right. But anyway, we can rely. People are actually surprisingly bad at thinking at predicting whether something is easy to remember, but we can collecting massive data sets estimate memorability scores for images and words and all kinds of things pretty reliably. And so this is kind of a key thing for studying memory. And then a third set of factors, probably something that you would all think about as kind of the common phenomena that we study in psychology or neuroscience are kind of internal states like attention. Are you really paying attention? Are you fatigued? How deeply you sort of process and internalize the stimuli that you're being presented with. Maybe you have some associations with past memories. So you specifically had an experience with this particular bridge that you are looking at a picture of. And so it might be easier for you to remember it than for someone who had never seen that picture before. And in a kind of recent review, Wilma Bainbridge, who is a big memorability scholar, kind of tried to summarize this as just in terms of the proportion of variance that can be accounted for by these different factors, that about 50% of it can be accounted for by memorability kinds of things, and then the other 50% is just this remaining variance that is basically these kind of, it has to be these internal factors. And so this is obviously of great interest to, this is the key question in terms of like, why do you remember some things and other things, at least stuff that happens at the time of the initial experience. Obviously, the situation that you're in when you try to recall it later can really affect things. But yeah, and so
Precision here is amazing.
sorry.
The precision here, 50.5%.
Yeah, that's not our proudest moment as a field. I think I wouldn't have said that, but it's yeah, whatever. I don't think this is like that precise. This is just it was in a paper. But it's something like that. There's a good chunk of it that is not explained by the stimulus or the experience, the perceptual input itself. That is probably explained by something going on internally. And we obviously it's difficult to measure these factors, even though it's something we really would like to measure, especially if we want to understand memory theoretically. And so in humans, at least, we often use neuroimaging or other observational neuroscience methods, and we hope that that's giving us some handle on these internal factors. That's kind of the promise, I think, of neuroimaging, that we can reconstruct these latent ideas. And since the 80s, a very common way to study this is known as a subsequent memory paradigm. So we might have, again, people are doing this kind of Lithuanian. This is just, they can study all kinds of things, but this is the kind of something that we're going to use. And so people might see these pairs of Lithuanian English words. And then we are also recording their neural activity at the same time. You get tons of different signals, for instance, out of fMRI or EEG, things that you might have experienced when you go, if you had to go to the hospital ever, but we also use it in the lab to study people functionally. And there's variance in these signals, and that potentially we then do a, so this is happening while they initially study something. They then do some sort of test, like they have to recall the cube recall test I mentioned. They get some of them right and some of them wrong. Now we can kind of sort these, and there might be some sort of correlation between that neural signal that we measured and the actual, like whether you remembered it later. And for about 40 years, people have basically said, well, this has got to be the internal factors because like it's the brain, it's correlating with memory performance. Like what else could it be? And so you can get these subsequent memory effects really reliably. I think my slides are, yeah, there you go. Subsequent memory effect. This is a huge literature. There's like, well, hundreds of studies on it. In 2011, Kim did this meta-analysis and showed that they're pretty reliable, at least in fMRI studies, which have been pretty common since the 90s. They're reliable regions of the brain that show differences in bold signal, depending on whether you're looking at something that you're later going to remember or not. And these are well known to people in the cognitive neuroscience memory.
All your examples or words, do you ever use numbers like 71334859777 and
Yeah, that's sort of a traditional. I think numbers are kind of too easy. Depending, it really depends on the task. If you go back to like the early studies, people use a lot of numbers or like digit, single letters, that kind of thing. Kind of depends on the what you're looking at. People use all kinds of stuff: pictures, videos, real life experiences. Just kind of words are kind of a nice balance for a lot of stuff. But a lot of this, well, actually here. I wasn't going to go into this, but on the left, these are verbal effects. On the right, these are pictorial effects. So actually, these effects can kind of be dependent on what kind of stimuli you're looking at, which makes sense because you have different brain regions that process words and images. And so these are kind of the most common things that use, but I'm sure there's.
They have an understanding what these regions are.
I mean, yes and no, or like yes, we have labels for them. Like we. There's a lot of understanding, but at the same time,
What role they play?
yeah, people put all kinds of labels on it. I think this is, in some sense, part of the problem. But yes, people will, parietal regions. This is all attention. This is has to do with attention. Partly, there's a big problem with what's called reverse inference in neuroscience, where you see something happening in a lot of tasks, you say this is, attention's involved in all these things. Therefore, parietal lobe. Probably much more specific than that, IFG, whatever, just saying things that I don't even know. Honestly, I'm a psychologist, but they, people put all kinds of labels on what these regions are doing.
How many images do they have?
Sorry?
What's the scale of the data set?
Bigger now than it used to be.
What is the scale?
Well, there's two kinds of scales. You can have the number of things that you have people do, like one person do.
Images. How many different human subjects have been used for this?
In total, across all of this entire literature, or per study?
Per study.
Again, that's been increasing over time. I mean, so in our study, we had we got over 60 people, which is large for a.
People machine learning will tell you this is tiny data sets.
Well, but these are very easy to find effects. I mean, I don't think there's any question actually that these differences exist. I think the question is really what is the meaning of them. But it's easy to find. Well, you collect lots of data per person, and so that's also going to determine how precise the measurement is. But this kind of like just the difference between two conditions is not going to take millions of. This is a within subject effect often because. So that's going to be also be like you're your own control. So it's a little bit the precision is a lot greater than if you're sort of getting one measure from me and one measure from another person. These more kinds of like the usual machine learning and neuroimaging stuff is about a cross-subject prediction of like disease or something like that, which is not the situation here. Yeah, Peter.
Are these regions independent of other brain activity? I'm imagining, for instance, if you play music and so got them distracted and then asked the same questions, would you get these same location?
No, I mean, there's some overlap. It's not exactly the same. I think, yeah, the whole brain is involved in lots of things. I think that's also a tricky.
Just like a quiet state, there's nothing else going on.
This is just average across lots of studies. Like the only real thing going on here is that you're looking at images or pictures or whatever, and you just take. Hopefully, you average across enough stuff that whatever else is driving the activity is not really. But I agree. I mean, also with what Michelle was saying, like power is a big problem here. Something we've dealt with as a field. My lab now collects, intracranial EEG on the order of 200 or 300 subjects in a study, which is definitely better than 60, which is definitely better than the first ever subsequent memory effects study, which was like 13 subjects. But also they were doing 480, looking at 480 pictures. So it's, the precision's pretty good.
How depends on the heterogeneity of the phenomena? I mean,
Yeah, right. So this isn't super, I mean, the heterogeneity, right. There's not like a universal amount of data that you need to collect to achieve a certain power. We went back and forth with reviewers a lot about whether our study had enough power to detect reasonable things. These kinds of effects are pretty, just a pure correlation or difference between when you're looking at something you're going to remember or not is not super difficult to find, I think. All right, let me just try to get more quickly. So this is just about pure activity. Like if you look in a particular voxel in a particular region, does just the signal there can be positive or negative effects. Like it can go in different directions in terms of what makes you more likely to remember something. But this is just the raw activity. There are other kinds of more complicated features we can derive from the brain. So a lot of work in the past 10, 15 years has been looking at more multivariate features. So for instance, if you look at the same thing multiple times, you see this same word pair multiple times, and then you take the neural activity in a particular region, you can ask how similar the the bold signal response was to having that experience. And this, we can kind of, just looking at sort of basic Pearson correlation between all of the features you observe in a particular time point. Although you can use other similarity metrics, but in general, people have found this is kind of a classic that Guishu and colleagues in Science 2010 showed that just generally more similar representations neurally means that you're more likely to remember that thing that you were looking at. And then there are other kinds of similarity measures, so we can look at the similarity across different experiences you had, which are not repeated, and ask whether more or less similarity predicts that you might think that having a more distinctive experience makes you more likely to remember something. And this is kind of dependent on region, but there are again lots of studies showing that this kind of a signal does correlate with memory pretty reliably in particular regions that you would expect. Even more recently, people have done things like looking at responses across people. And so if you have a more similar response to other people when you're looking at the same thing, does that make you more or less likely to remember something? And so now I think some people were getting at this before. We can ask, like, what are these, you get these differences, what do they actually represent? And a lot of people in the literature basically, despite knowing, everyone knows correlation is not causation, but then they're like, yeah, these are moment-to-moment fluctuations in the quality of memory encoding. This is, in that meta-analysis, he was like, yeah, this is activity that supports successful encoding or leads to encoding failure. People put all kinds of labels: attention, fatigue, representational fidelity, degree of associative binding. And so you would think that this is like basically the 50%, this neural activity is capturing the 50% of internal factors that's explaining what causes us to remember this stuff and not one thing and not something else. It's these kinds of different neural activity patterns that are happening when you experience it. And so this is getting back to causal modeling that we heard about earlier today. So I think if you were to write down a kind of implicit model of what's going on here, there's basically some signals that we measure with fMRI that are related to causal neural activity that causes you to remember stuff. And then there's other signals that are non-causal and they were the regions of the brain that did not feature into that meta-analysis. And there's kind of, at a very broad level, there are these two populations, some of which impacts memory and some of which doesn't. And we can use just basic associations. If this is the true model, maybe there's some other factors that affect whether you remember something. Although ultimately, basically, if you're not a dualist, it all has to go through the brain. But yeah, if this were the true model, we could just like do the kinds of differences that I was showing you before, and that would tell us like this region of the brain is really like that's fMRI signal is measuring the causal neural activity because it showed a difference between good and bad memory performance. But like I already told you about, there's all these things that are more, some things are more memorable than others. So for instance, if a word is more concrete, like house or tree, you can easily think about what that is. You can't really, like justice or love is a more abstract idea. And if you have these two different types of words, well, first of all, it's a major driver of memorability, and so abstract things are harder to remember, recognize than concrete things. And if you just present words to people, this is a meta-analysis from 2010, there's just different patterns of activity in response to those words. And so it drives a lot of fMRI bold signal. And presumably not all of this activity is actually involved in memory encoding, like it's just processing the word, but maybe doesn't have any causal impact on the memory encoding. And so actually we have this big giant confounder, which is concreteness. And so we don't even know what the SME is really measuring. In fact, William Bainbridge and colleagues have shown that just memorability in general, more memorable images have just different patterns of brain activity than less memorable images. And so again, if this is not, some of this activity could just be perceptual semantic features that make something more memorable, like maybe red things are easier to remember than green things. I don't know if that's true actually, but it could be. And if you have a color region, that's not necessarily going to, like if you changed activity there, we were able to manipulate it using stimulation or something like that, that's not going to necessarily change your memory for that experience. And then similarly, I mentioned order effects. So serial position can be a major confound if you have a bunch of things, and if you sort of show people things sequentially, where it fell in that sequence, early things generally, depending on the situation, early things can be much easier to remember than later things. And I'm sure there's fMRI effects too, but the classic effect in scalp EEG is just that you get way more high gamma power, which is kind of a correlate of general neural activity. And so basically all these exogenous perceptual kind of features of the experience can drive both this causal and non-causal activity, and are basically a major confound for whatever the SME is supposed to be. And what we really want to know is, this causal neural activity that is both possibly coming from these perceptual exogenous variables, and so maybe you perceive something as more concrete at one time point than another time point, that presumably makes you more likely to remember it. Or you just have sort of these ongoing like attentional fluctuations, maybe you're more tired, and so that sort of prior causal activity, that endogenous variables that are also sort of causing your memory performance to be better or not. But what we want to sort of distinguish this from non-causal neural activity, those regions of the brain that are really just not involved in memory. And there might be some other non-causal endogenous psychological constructs or neural activity. The one sort of tricky thing here is that because this is fMRI, we're really not directly measuring things. We can't really know whether we're looking at the actual activity itself, or maybe just sort of an indicator, something that was downstream of that. And so I'm not going to have any time to do this, but basically we're going to fix all of our perceptual input that can introduce confounds, and then try to estimate the memorability of specific combinations of perceptual input features, and then use a sort of regression approach to adjust. And so we basically had people study these kinds of pairs of Lithuanian words. I'm going to kind of skip, but just like the task that I showed you before, people would study these pairs and then do a kind of distractor task. And then later they would do a queued recall test where they would have to respond with the corresponding English word within 12 seconds. They did the study session in the scanner and then did the rest of the experiment out of the scanner. We had 57 fMRI subjects, and there was sort of a generally broad across the kinds of things that people studied. There was a broad diversity in terms of how easy they were to remember, and also in terms of how good the subjects were. So first, just to show you kind of a more standard just correlation with memory performance. We use a little bit of a complicated fitting approach, but we're going to compare using just this sort of more standard subsequent memory approach with a causal subsequent memory approach where we try to estimate the memorability of a particular item in a particular location in a study sequence, and then adjust for these parameters. And so basically, we're just going to compare the model with adjustment to the basic standard model that people use without adjustment. We'll test all the kinds of features that I mentioned before in a bunch of different regions. I won't go into this too much. We're going to use cross-validation to estimate the models. This is pretty standard stuff, I think, for this audience. The basic story is that if we just use the standard subsequent memory approach, we do see lots of signals. Everything correlates with memory like we'd expect. We see lots of stuff, basically just replicating a lot of studies from the past. The problem is that then when we fit the full model with these memorability scores, the memorability score itself already predicts memory pretty well. People's own behavioral judgments of learning, which I didn't have time to get into, also actually improve on that, suggesting that there may be measuring some sort of causal activity, so people can actually read out this causal activity, but none of the measures that people standardly use in the literature that have been reported as subsequent memory effects are actually sort of correlate with memory beyond what you could just get from the basic memorability. And so we replicated many previous subsequent memory effects, discovered some new ones, but it seems like maybe these subsequent memory effects are in fact not causally related to memory. And just overall, observational causal inference is kind of a key idea for cognitive neuroscience, that especially when we want to go from explaining behavior from the brain or mind, where we cannot actually control internal dynamics. This is super important, but pretty rarely considered. Yeah, and we're still working on a lot of these kind of things.
At the end of the day, what can you say about the 50%? Anything?
From this study?
Yeah.
That
Or
we.
like in your previous studies, what they were saying.
Nothing. I think. I think that kind of everyone's wasting their time. We probably don't have the precision. We probably need more power, a lot more power than anyone thought we did to actually measure, really distinguish causal effects. And I think probably the most useful direction, which I'm working on now, is sort of using experimental manipulations of neural activity, either through brain stimulation or timing, as kind of an instrumental variable for changing the neural signal, and then using some sort of recording device to try to figure out what's actually causing the memory. But yeah, I think most of the approaches that people have used in the past probably didn't tell us very much about which brain regions are involved in memory.
Is memorability an objective feature?
Basically, yeah. Or like it's pretty consistent. Like if you estimate it on some population and draw more samples from the rest of the population, like they'll still basically remember the stuff. Stuff that some people find easy to remember, other people also find easy to remember. It's pretty consistent. And Wilma Bainbridge has a whole Odd Oliva and Anthony Torralba, who's a computer scientist at MIT, maybe some people know, have a whole program on sort of predicting using sort of deep learning, whatever, to predict memorability directly from images or videos. So it's measurable and objective, I guess. Probably depends a lot on the population that you're studying, but it's pretty consistent. Yeah, Karen.
Thank you for the good talk. I have one simple question and a couple follow-ups for that simple question. So the simple question is this: who are the subjects for these studies?
Here it was people from the NYU community. Now I work a lot with epilepsy patients who have implanted intracranial electrodes. Obviously, a lot of this is going to depend on the subjects, and it will be better for the neuroscience community to acknowledge that. But yeah.
Okay, so the follow-up question number one is: are there any comparative studies of memory among people of, let's say, the same age who are of different socioeconomic classes?
Yeah,
Which would
definitely.
mean that there would be a different, I would assume, a different kind of diet, and that's
mean,
one question.
like media diet or something, or experiences.
People who are, let's say, more diet based more on carbohydrates, fast food, versus diet based on vegetables, fruits, blah blah blah.
I don't know offhand, but I'm positive someone has done that.
And that would be an interesting study.
Sure. Yeah.
I wonder how much of this is, time of day.
Yeah, they're big time of day
particular
effects.
times of day, and also
Yeah.
whether it's short term or long term, how quickly you go and ask the question, the follow up question.
Yeah, I mean, all of these are big drivers of. I mean, time of day is going to be certainly a major predictor of how attentive you are. In these kinds of studies, that's going to show up more as a cross subject, like a component of the variance across people, rather than like within a person, like why did they remember some things and not other things. So that's not exactly the kind of thing we're looking at here, but you can show really big time of day effects in terms of whether people are going to be good or bad. Also, lots of variability across people in terms of what time is good for them. Yeah.
Okay, let's thank you.
Yeah. Sorry. I'll talk about this later.